Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of April, 2024 year. A huge number of events have happened today, and perhaps today. The most important event of the spring of 2024 year has happened. I am not talking about the event, the situation between Israel and Iran, the number of strikes and other situations. We are talking mainly about Ukraine. And what is important, and what is the main thing, what is the main event that has happened exactly in the last 24 hours? There was no geolocation on this occasion, there was no video on this. This is not some kind of breakthrough or something else. A simple message, it would seem, is a text message that is contained in the summary of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. What was interesting in the report of the Ministry of Defense? It's very simple. Today, on the 14th of April, 2024 year, Army Group North began its combat activity. Let's say combat history. Yes, dear friends, Army Group North. What is it? Let me remind you that before, say, April 14th, there were several groups of the army. Several groups of troops of the armed forces of the Russian Federation that took part in a special military operation. This is, of course, an army group in the Kapinski direction. This is the West. Army Group West, they've been here a long time. At the beginning of the year, there was a small regrouping. They merged with Kapinski and Limansky directions into Odnokapinski. Then the Donetsk direction. Our Donetsk direction is a group of the army, a group of forces, a group of the south. Then the center is directly the Avdiivka direction. Further on, in the southeast direction, this is our group Vostok. And starting from Zaporozhye to Kherson, this is the Dnipro group, yes, a special such grouping, a separate one. So today began its existence and its military path to the north, yes. And according to the Ministry of Defense, the reports of the Ministry of Defense, this group works precisely in the Belgorod direction. That is, the first combat. Today is its first official, let's say, inclusion in the summary of the Ministry of Defense. I think that the group itself, let's say the North grouping, began its combat, let's say baptism, during the Ukrainian offensive. When fighting was conducted in the settlement of Grey Raven, it is, let's say, in Kazinki and other settlements. But then the Ministry of Defense simply limited itself to reports that fighting was being conducted in Belgorod the direction, without specifying the specific group that conducted these hostilities. Today, it is officially the North Group. That is now, in connection with the emergence of new ones, in connection, let's say, with the announcement of these new facts. We can conclude that in fact the main task of the armed forces of Ukraine during those Grayvorn offensives there. Not only Gravon, there was also a settlement in the Sumy region called. Well, I think you remember these settlements perfectly. Here it is. And Antes, yes. The main task of the Apu offensive was something like stirring up the hive, yes. In other words, the server group is not here today. They were not transferred today, they are already concentrated here. Is there a large Russian grouping along the border, starting somewhere from Sumy to Kharkiv? Of course not. They have been here for a long time. And the main task of the Apu, the attack on the Apu, let's say the distance of Tetkin, Kozing, Grayvorn, was to stir up the hive. In order to understand in general what forces, what resources, what reserves, what this group has in general, what it is capable of. And we remember with you how the armed forces of Ukraine were defeated as much as possible in a few days. In general, I understood that at that time, the police were able to understand what they were dealing with, and what in principle was expected, after which Zelensky gave the order to build everything possible in 3 shifts. 24/7, for probably an infinite number of shifts, defensive lines for his father in Kharkov. So as then it became clear to Zelensky and the command of the NATO armed forces, with what superior forces they will have to face in the near future. And immediately after the Apu managed to stir up this hive, and they realized what they were dealing with, the Russian Federation, when it realized that there was no point in hiding, but it was necessary to start the operation gradually. Began to launch air bombing, missile strikes, equaling Kharkiv. There, let's say, all the heating stations, all the power plants, there are some bridges, logistics, all the air defense. And now we must understand that these strikes were not a consequence of the fact that the APU stepped on Grayvorin. It was an initially planned operation of concentration of forces in order to create a sanitary buffer zone. The APU simply conducted reconnaissance by combat or reconnaissance of force, and during this reconnaissance, it turned out that they began, let's say, the Kharkiv buffer operation. In these frames today, the Ministry, which published the Ministry of Defense, we see with you another ARI steam air defense system, which was destroyed along with the radar in the area of the settlement of Kharkiv. And according to the report of the Ministry of Defense over the past day, the APU in the Belgorod direction lost up to 60 people killed, wounded, 4 pieces of equipment, and 1 artillery stop. Well, including, as we see, the Ukrainian Aresti air defense system was also destroyed near the settlement of Rogin. Despite the losses in the air defense, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, still promises and already seems to be saying how he provided additional Patriot systems, an additional system on the territory of Ukraine. And he also talked about it on his official page in the social network X and well, so far in the air defense of Ukraine. It seems to be gradually, systematically, is periodically destroyed, but despite this, new supplies are being replaced. They are trying to support the air defense of Ukraine at some combat level. Well, on the 14th of April, the official start of the Kharkov offensive operation. While it will naturally be limited to small maneuvers along the border, the destruction of strong points. And it is unlikely that a big offensive should be expected before May 9th. Perhaps it is even unlikely that we should wait for it until May 20th or May 21st. While Zelensky will still be officially acting in Ukraine as president, perhaps after May 21st. When his terms the powers will expire, a completely different story will begin. A completely different page in the history of Ukraine as a whole. And perhaps the special military operation itself will transform into something else. And then the offensive will most likely begin. Although it is possible earlier. What have we been waiting for? We are moving with you along the line of combat contact. There is a slight revival of hostilities along the Borovaya line. Here in the digs. Artillery strikes in Kapanki. Strikes are being carried out on the points of temporary deployment of the armed forces of Ukraine. So far, the strikes are very powerful, even to some extent resembles artillery training. Perhaps in the near future, we should expect an intensification of hostilities on the part of the Russian army. Along the line of the district town of Samikapanki. Even harder, including in the area of the settlement of Chernyshina, we will see with you. A blow with a loomer, a rather rare phenomenon in this direction. Basically, the Russian army had at least operated on the Amuraman in Malinovka before. Well, maybe some units were transferred here. Then we are moving with you to the Seversk direction. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continuing the assault actions of Bologorovka. So far, it has not been possible to get off the ground, it has not been possible, or it may be possible to do it in the near future. Everything possibly heavy has already been pulled up here. If before that we have seen the cleaning of this area with TOS, Suns, drones, aerial bombs, then today, by the way. It is worth noting the massive mass use of this type of weapon as the aviation cluster projectile ARB C-500. They are working quite tightly on the fields, on the strong points, and as you can see, all strikes are being inflicted east of the chalk dump, most likely in the near future. We should expect an attempt to attack by this route. It is possible to enter this forest first, but in the near future, obviously, this operation will begin to be carried out. And a similar story can be observed with you south of Verkhnykamiansky, in these frames, south of the stronghold, which the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to establish control over, let's say, a few days ago, over this stronghold. Footage of a strike on these southern forest belts is already being published today. Let's watch this video now. So, for more clarity, these are the blows. Processing is going on quite powerfully. And these are, let's say, the strongholds of the armed forces of Ukraine, which are located just to the south, southeast of Verkhnykamiensky and northwest of the settlement of Disputable. Here, among other things, some kind of attempt is possible to wedge into the positions of the AFU, with the aim of further offensive in the Seversky direction. There is no news on the excavation today. Let me remind you that yesterday we discussed the capture or possible capture of strong points, let's say along the railway. To date, there has been no confirmation of this capture. In the area of Razdalovka, as in previous days, unmanned aircraft are operating. Drones of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Strikes are being carried out on the settlements of Vasakivka, more precisely on farms where soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine are holed up, including strikes on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine and in the area of Razdalovka. No active combat and assault actions were taken. Then we are moving with you 4 hours Yar. There is an interesting situation here. Here the situation continues to develop extremely interesting. We have slightly updated the map. If you see, now we have finally painted over the fields between the Popov Forest, the canal and, let's say, the Golubkov second mortars, in connection with the geolocation of drone strikes of heights on the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. These shots were enough for us to paint this area completely under the color of Russian control. And from an interesting point of view, it is worth noting that today Siersky spoke and said with the idea that Putin, that the command of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the leadership of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, set the task for the command of the Ukrainian army to take control of the Clock Yar by the 9th of May. Well, it's hard to imagine how it can be done in general until the 9th of May, but perhaps Siersky has some information. Or he himself understands that it is possible, and in general, that the situation in the hour in Yara is much more unattractive than what we see with you in fact. Well, let's now gradually on. According to Bogdanovka hours in Yara, in the direction of today, more and more cartographers confirm the taking of full and establishing full control over the settlement of Bogdanovka. So far, no geolocations have been published confirming this promotion, but they assure us, they promise us all, that there is such a promotion, namely the pro-Ukrainian cartographic service Deep State, while we keep the map as it is. At the same time, information is being published that the Russian army continues to advance along Bogdanovka towards the forest, let's say, to enter Kalinovka from the south, again only as messages without any confirmation. It is worth noting that the Russian army is very seriously pressing and trying to advance along the line, say, Popyle, then Golubkovsky mortars to the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and in the southern direction Ivanovskaya, and also in the same direction German Forest, and say, Seversky Donetsk-Donbass to us. Now the footage has been published here on this day of strikes by the flamethrower systems of the Sunpik. According to the positions in the USU, it is, let's say, in this forest, that the Golubkov mortars are, let's say. Such artillery training is going on. The blows are powerful. We see with you how the area is completely controlled, shot through. So far, there have been no active, let's say, actions on the ground, at least at altitude. As you can see, there is a German forest and Golubkov mortars here. And the Golubkovsky mortars are at a height, and the German forest, which is located in the drawing, it is located in the lowlands. So, while strikes are being carried out on the Golubkovsky mortars, in order to sweep further progress and exit, let's say, to the eastern Yar with a southern direction, if we talk about the German forest, then according to individual reports, as we discussed with you, the Russian army has already established control over this part, and the Russian fighters have already come close to the channel Seversky Donetsk-Donbass. And according to some cartographers the distance is less than 1 kilometer. At the same time, the Russian army has already established full fire control over the main crossings, the main routes. From 1 hour from the Yar to the other, it becomes extremely impossible and very difficult to move. But so far the AFU fighters continue to resist. Although despite all this, and here the main, let's say, the basis of defense at least in the eastern part, let's say, lies on the shoulders of the 67th Mechanized Brigade. And recently there have been quite a lot of scandals not only with them, but also with the 25th, when some kind of critical situation, difficult moments, They simply begin to abandon positions, retreat. Therefore, checks have already begun today in the ranks of the 67th. The commanders aimed, as I understand it, at preventing the collapse of the front, since surely in the near future we should expect the most critical situation in this direction. And in order to preserve, let's say, the backbone, not to let the collapse, I begin to drill and study the leadership of the 67th. Well, so specifically checks that everything is clear, that orders are followed, and that everything is carried out clearly. And they are not allowed, let's say, to easily pass the Russian fighters through the eastern hours of the Yar. In the Kleshivka area, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to carry out artillery strikes, stripping with the use of drones of a bridgehead in this area, without an active phase on the ground. Then we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction, from where the most interesting information and the most interesting shots are most likely coming today. And we will start with you from the northern direction, to be more precise, from the settlement of the Q. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to develop a successful offensive in the direction of the settlement, in the direction of the second line of defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. Let me remind you that the next line of defense after the one that has actually fallen is Berdik-Semenovka-Umansky, Yasnobrodovka-Natailova. The next line of defense goes along the lane of the next line, Novobakhmutovka, Solovyova, Novoprakhovskaya, Novoselovka, the first. And then Boring, and we get into the Charles Reservoir. This is the next line of defense, and the Russian army is already approaching it, and from several directions, including from those directions from which this offensive was not expected. Let me remind you that we literally discussed the other day that during the offensive actions, we managed to establish full control over this railway, over these forest belts. And today, footage is already being received that the advanced units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to break through the defense in USU under heavy fire from mortars and artillery, and, in general, enter this dacha village. This is evidenced by only small footage of drone strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine. This can be seen on here at the 45th second. Here is a frame, these dachas. Pay attention, there are already big, or rather large forces of the Russian army coming right here. Stormtroopers are already moving in large numbers. Here, pay attention to this bridge. Here, pay attention to the bridge. And here is this bridge on the map. In other words, the place was geolocated as soon as possible. The Russian fighters were advancing along this forest belt, a small forest like this, along a dacha village. That is, we are. In other words, it is certainly obvious that the control is much broader and more, but we kind of tried to estimate approximately where this offensive could have come from. That is, the most important thing is that at the moment it is going with it for a key height in the Okretinsky direction. And it is already obvious that Russian fighters are moving as calmly as possible around the dacha village itself. For sure the village will creep up in the near future, and then it will be the most critical situation for the AFU. And with the exit of the Russian army and, let's say, even at some point the degree of rupture of a single node of the APU defense in the direction of Novi Bakhmutovka Osheratina. That is, the cutting of the supply line, the automatic fall in general, almost the collapse of the entire line of defense, and wedging into the settlements of Cheratin, then a completely different story will begin. At the same time, I remind you that the Russian army is trying to advance along Stepovaya Street in Novobakhmutovka as much as possible. Today, the court made several attempts to counterattack along this street, but this small street is already under full control. During the counteroffensive attempt, another Ukrainian tank was hit and destroyed. At the same time, the Russian army continues to develop and expand the bridgehead, let's say from the railway, in the direction of the west, to the same Novopokrovsky. That is, after all, no one is going to leave Berdik in the rear. Everyone probably understands that Berdik's fate is predetermined. But it is still difficult to move forward here somehow. The control of the Russian army over this forest belt has also been confirmed. There are shots present showing drone strikes of the armed forces of Ukraine on the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Attempts are being made to storm Berdik from the north and from the northeast, until the attempts end successfully. Everything here is littered with minefields, and in an attempt to overcome the minefield, they are suffering heavy losses in equipment. In iron, the personnel somehow more or less manage to dodge the blows. Here in these frames, after the Hitbehi, the composition of the armed forces of the Russian Federation personally tries to run in the direction of the Dernia River itself, and strikes are being struck with artillery on the retreating ones. There is still a little resistance in the Berdeks themselves. Artillery strikes are regularly carried out on the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the AFU and Berdek themselves. Equipment is destroyed, Krasnopol is beaten, sunbursts are struck, that is, the terrain is cleaned up as much as possible, and prepared for Russian troops, for the entry of Russian troops on the main supply route Semenovka-Novoselovka I, including the IF drones regularly operate in order to minimize the possibility of transferring personnel, including evacuating. In these frames, we can most likely observe the evacuation process with you. A little further to the west, we can pay attention to you as another evacuation vehicle or, well, just another Bradley, is already trying to leave Semenovka and it is being hit by drones from behind. That is, based on these two frames, you and I see some kind of evacuation on the first one, on a Humvee, most likely. They are trying to put the wounded in the Humvee and take them out. And here we see Bradley already eating himself, let's say, in the direction of Novoselovka first. That is, two frames, two videos, which in some indirect manner confirm to us that most likely the AFU has already left Semenovka. And in the near future, the Russian army will finally clean up the same Semenovka, the same Berdek, and the movement, thereby entering the operational expanses. Then the movement will continue towards the next line defense, where, among other things, an active counter-battery struggle is carried out constantly and regularly, let's say. Today, for example, as a result of another, let's say, our duel, the Ukrainian side lost a 2-1 howitzer. A blow was not struck with the use of, let's say, an accurate Krasnopol projectile. On the territory along the Barano-Manskaya-Yasnobrodovkine-Telova line, there are no changes today. There are some shots, pictures of various cartographers about the further offensive, but no shots were received from the area, including no news on, let's say, this ledge, which is under the control of the APU, not the army and Mayday. Well, here in the near future, for sure, hostilities will resume, and for sure they will resume when, say, the flooding of this area reaches its maximum, if it has not already gone down. Here on these separate frames, individual sources publish the situation in which the region found itself after the destruction of the Charles Dam. As we see, well, of course it's not with you, not the Kakhovskaya Dam, it's not like that here. The damage is not so serious, but even though there is a little damage, some roads are crossed, some roads are blocked. And of course there are some problems and difficulties with logistics. There is no news on Krasnogorovka, including almost no news on Georgievka. An operational pause is already being delayed here. There have been no active actions for days. In Konstantinovka, Novomikhailovka, fighting continues, despite the fact that some sources report that they have already managed to clean up and left the APU. So far, no information has been received confirming this. The armed forces of the Russian Federation made several attempts to attack along the Novomikhailovka-Pobeda line, tried to attack in the fields. But all attacks, at least the gusts, were repulsed by the armed forces of Ukraine. Several pieces of equipment were destroyed, but in general, let's say the alignment of the front line is underway. And an attempt is being made to finally align the front line approximately according to this story. That is, everything that will be located, say, on the right side of the red line. The armed forces of the Russian Federation want to establish control over, as it were, as close and tight as possible to the Paraskovevka of the north and Konstantinovka, including. In Novomikhailovka, we see with you on the footage of artillery strikes on the AFU strongholds, let's say in the southwestern part. Preparations are underway for the final, let's say ground part. Perhaps this final ground part has already happened, and you and I are getting old, already outdated footage. But so far we have nothing else to change or refute something there. Then we are moving with you to the area of Ugledar. No news. For a temporary tactical bridgehead, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continues to fabize the Yurga harvest. after some individual units managed to gain a foothold on the southernmost outskirts along the forest belt. The Russian army continues to sweep the strongholds instead of deploying the Apu a little to the north. In the near future, we should also expect the resumption of hostilities. Right before I started shooting the video, we received footage of an artillery strike and the destruction of another bridge in the area of Velikaya Novoselovka, so to speak along the Kashligok River. It seems like this bridge was destroyed. Let me remind you that the other day the Russian army destroyed the bridge over the Wetyali. Today, we received footage of the destruction of this bridge. In other words, logistics is destroyed as much as possible, destroyed in the direction which first of all indicates that, including the direction of Velika Novoselovka, is the highest priority for the armed forces of the Russian Federation, since quite large resources are invested here. The work of Pedron drones has intensified. In the footage, a large number of shots were published by beavers on striking the strongholds of the forest belt, which are under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, a sweep is being carried out. A strike is being inflicted on infantry. That is, there is an assumption that in the near future the armed forces of the Russian Federation will resume hostilities in this direction. There is no news on, let's say, the deeper direction. And, among other interesting things, it is also worth noting that Western sources, the Western press writes, that the Ukrainians are planning to finally, to be more precise, the British newspaper Zazen. The Ukrainians are planning to finally destroy the Crimean Bridge for the third time somewhere in the middle of summer. Well, somewhere in the middle of July, this is already Zelensky's promise. Well, let's see. In any case, we must clearly understand with you, regardless of whether the bridge will be destroyed, there will not be. There will simply be an attempt, either something like that or something else. We must understand that this will happen already under the illegitimate President Zelensky, and it may end up with big unpleasant consequences for him, including recognition of him as a terrorist. But it will already be somewhere in the middle of July. And that's it, dear friends.